We have achieved great things. We have made giant leaps. We've gone far beyond what we thought was possible. But we have only just begun. Our future in space is unlimited, and it will benefit all humanity. But it will take hard work, new technologies, advanced financing models, and enabling public policy. The Beyond Earth Institute is creating a policy and legal framework to enable the creation of economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. We will engage all stakeholders on critical policy issues: property rights in space, norms of behavior, conflict resolution protocols, filling the technology gaps, exploring new financing mechanisms, and making space settlement an agreed goal of the U.S. and its allies. Beyond Earth is committed to the true purpose of why we go to space. Join us on this journey.
Hello, I'm Steve Wolf, president of the Beyond Earth Institute, and welcome to our program today entitled Human Spaceflight Safety in Concept and Practice, Which Way Forward? Before I introduce the program and the moderator today, however, I just have a few announcements. First, I want to give a shout out to Beyond Earth co-founder Tom Murata and his company, the Spaceport Company, that yesterday launched a sounding rocket from an offshore platform, the first of its kind, in fact. This was a proof of concept for his company, so congratulations, Tom. We look forward to more success in the future. We are excited about Axiom 2, a commercial mission that arrived successfully at the International Space Station, commanded by Peggy Whitson. Congratulations, Axiom. A big congratulations go to Blue Origin also for being awarded a contract to develop a second lunar lander for the Artemis program. SpaceX, of course, has the first lunar lander contract, so congratulations, Blue. And now for some news about the Beyond Earth Institute. We have kicked off our working group program as part of the Leadership Council initiative. The working groups that we've created include commercial space stations, advanced financing, health and safety, and cislunar economy. For those of you interested in taking part in the Leadership Council and the working groups that we've created, there's now a page on our website that provides information on how you can get involved, and we encourage you to do so. I also want to announce that the Beyond Earth has agreed to serve as co-chair of the AIAA's Policy and Strategy subgroup of its newly created Cislunar Ecosystem Working Group it's managed by the Aerospace Corporation. Courtney Stead and I will be heading the working group along with Aerospace Corporation's Kara Kuzman. We look forward to a very productive and collaborative working arrangement in that regard. And again, please mark your calendars for the second annual Beyond Earth Symposium to be held on November 1st and 2nd at the American University. Look forward to seeing you there. And now on to our program. I envision a future when traveling to space, whether it's to the moon, Mars, or other places in the solar system, will be as safe as air travel is today. Now, face it, if we must get to this level of safety, if we are to ever realize a future where thousands and even millions of people will choose to migrate to new homes off of this planet. However, our moderator today, Courtney Stead, never fails to remind me that we are very far from achieving that goal. For the foreseeable future, space travel will remain a very high-risk mode of transport for humans, without a doubt. Most of you are aware that a moratorium on human space flight regulations will expire this year, and it's forcing the administration and Congress to wrestle with what to do next. For today's discussion, we have assembled the experts who have been in the trenches on this topic. We may not come up with a definitive answer today, and I don't expect that we will, but we certainly will dig very deeply into this issue. So to lead the discussion today, I turn this over to the very able hands of Courtney Stead, the Beyond Earth Executive Vice President. Courtney?
Always perilous to give me the floor, but I thank you for doing that. Steve, I want to thank you for your leadership and the vision for Beyond Earth Institute, and a special call out to Cody Nympher, our very talented program planning associate who put together this outstanding panel. As a moderator, I put a premium on audience participation, so please, and I see we've got a great turnout. I see a number of friends and colleagues from both government, the Hill, and industry, academia. Put your comments, put your questions in the chat room. Do my best to incorporate that into the discussion. And I want to thank our panelists for taking time from impossibly busy schedules to discuss this important and timely topic. Again, human spaceflight safety in the context of the emergence of commercial crewed space habitats, which leads to what can be a fraught debate regarding the appropriate role of the federal government in overseeing public safety in space, human activities in Earth orbit and beyond. Fraught because human safety should be in the forefront of all planning for space-based activity, but defining the protocols is non-trivial. Fraught given the billions of dollars of investment by the private sector and the fragile early stage of an industry with arguably a steep learning curve, where federal overreach or potential overreach can send chilling signals, even if unintended, to the investment community. And as we meet, the administration is continuing to discuss, debate which agency, the FAA or Commerce, should be the lead for setting the standards for the space sector. And there's, of course, as Steve alluded to, no shortage of commercial crewed activities happening now or in prospect. And as the sector grows, questions regarding how government policy should promote occupant safety abound. Questions such as, should the status quo restriction on regulation of vehicle design, manufacturing, operation continue? What is the role of industry safety standards, and should the government seek authority to enforce them? So on and so forth. We put a few of those in the promotion for this webinar. And as we engage these questions, the audience, you need to recall some vital history. When Congress passed the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Statute Act of 2004, it recognized that commercial human spaceflight was an experimental and risky activity. It also required operators to inform customers of their safety records so people could make an informed choice based on levels of risk. And that spaceflight regulatory learning period, you're going to hear that phrase a number of times today, restricting the FAA from issuing operating requirements and design regulations for human occupant safety, is now scheduled to expire in the fall of this year, unless other actions are taken. So you can see why this webinar is so important and so timely. Our panelists' impressive bios are on our website in case you wish more details. Jim Muncie, Principal, Pollard Space, former staff member, House Subcommittee, Space Committee. I've known him for 40 years, actively involved with all things commercial space policy, and as well as the FAA space-related rulemakings, intimately involved with the 2004 commercial space launch amendments and the follow-up actions, and so has good insight, I think, into congressional intent. Karen Sharonwork, President, CS Consulting, has worked with a number of the marquee rocket companies, the Relativities, the SpaceX. She worked in government, OMB, Congress, has an impressive experience as lead attorney Washington ops with those rocket companies, sits on the FAA ComStack, and now has her own consulting venture and has much in the field practical experience with various rulemakings. Dr. George Neal, the President, Commercial Space Transportation, Space Technologies, George, formerly head of the FAA AST Office, Associate Administrator, PhD Aerospace Engineering, and recently flew on a Blue New Glenn mission, so he knows firsthand the safety and waiver issues as a space passenger. And last but not least, Brigadier General retired Bruce McClintock, who's Senior Policy Researcher, RAND Corporation, graduate of the storied Air Force Academy, has formidable engineering technical chops, who worked on the recent RAND study. Bruce has also brought his flat jacket. He knows that the study has received some mixed response by industry, but believe me, he is more than prepared to defend its methodology and findings. Finally, a member of the audience, Rand Simberg, a subject expert in his own right, who's written a book some years back on this topic of safety in space, will have a question or comment as part of the audience. Now, for veterans of these webinars, you know the format. I'll ask each panelist to spend a few minutes summarizing his or her views on, in this case, whether the learning period should be extended or not, and whatever other comments they wish to make. And then I'll initiate the discussion with specific questions. The last 15 or so minutes will be devoted to audience questions. And panelists, please forgive me if I appear a little heavy-handed in cutting short some of the remarks while I do my best to ensure that all of you can share your important perspectives, while, again, leaving time for the audience and then a couple of minutes for our Commander-in-Chief, Steve Wolf, to wrap things up. So let's start with you, Jim, and then we'll follow with Karen and George and then Bruce. And Jim, in your comments, I wonder if you could incorporate into your initial remarks your insights into the intent of Congress as you understand it regarding the statutory reference to the learning period. So turn the microphone over to you, Jim.
In 2003, we had just lost Columbia. And at the same time, several small companies were developing reusable suborbital vehicles, what became Virgin Galactic, X-Core, Armadillo Aerospace, and several others, were all developing small vehicles with the idea of either winning the X Prize and or pursuing a commercial market carrying average citizens into suborbital space. Whereas NASA used analysis to estimate the safety of the shuttle, and that repeatedly overestimated the safety, industry wanted to collect actual flight data from dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of flights. The idea was to build up a statistically significant amount of data about the design features, the component technologies, and the operating practices, with everyone competing against each other with their different approaches to spaceflight. The only way to do that was to fly for revenue, which required, we thought in modern era, I mean, back in the early days of aviation, it was, anybody could fly whatever plane they could get a hold of and sell rides to people and sometimes kill them. We didn't believe in that. We believed in an informed consent regime where the company was required to tell and actually show with data what the safety record of the company was and the company's vehicle was. And then of course, you would have full regulation to protect the uninvolved public, but anyone who got on board to ride and buy a flight would have to be told safety record of the vehicle. And we left the issue of regulating participant safety to the interests of the industry as a whole. In other words, because the FAA had the authority to promote the industry, if there came a time, like in the 1920s in aviation, where there were bad actors in the industry and were hurting the image of the industry as a whole, despite the fact that many companies, or even most companies, were doing a good job adopting all the lessons learned, staying up with the state of the art. If there were bad companies involved, then, to promote the industry, it made sense to regulate to eliminate the bad actors. And the existing authority of the FAA to promote the industry would give them that. Unfortunately, after the House passed the original bill, like what I've described, the Senate said, well, we'd like something specific in there about, a separate mandate for the government to worry about occupant safety. So we agreed, and they gave that to them. But while they gave them authority to regulate, that authority to regulate for occupant safety was limited to actual demonstrated issues. In other words, either an accident showing that there was a failure in the vehicle or operating practice, or an incident which could have led to an accident. And
Jim, not to interrupt you, I'm sorry to be rude, but if you, because I want to get into some of those issues you're alluding to.
So that's the issue of the learning period is simply, should the government be limited to only regulate if there is evidence requiring regulation, or should they be allowed to regulate prospectively without data, without any specific reason to regulate? Could be based on analysis or something else.
And as I move over to Karen, from your standpoint, extending, as far as you're concerned, let's extend the moratorium, right? Bottom line, Jim.
Oh, absolutely. I think we need to replace it with something permanent, and it would take at least a year to develop that.
We'll circle back to you. Thank you, sir. Karen, you're on.
Great, thank you. Courtney, any specific things that you want me to address as I...
Well, you've heard what Jim said. I think you're right. This is such a multifaceted issue, but I think your view on the extension of the learning period and just any overall comments you might have about the status of rulemaking in this area.
Excellent. So I think, one of the things that I've been focused on, and as was mentioned earlier, as a member of ComStack, I'm really pleased to be able to support the Office of Commercial Space Transportation as an outside voice and a member of industry, and to bring, hopefully, positively to bear experience from working with launch operators, as well as, working on human spaceflight activities. And so, it's been an interesting couple of years. So, having most recently worked at a launch operator who has launched a vehicle under Part 450, I'll note, as we discussed in the ComStack meeting, I guess last week, there are significant challenges that AST faces right now in being able to address, resource needs for fulfilling its current obligations and authorities under its existing law, right? So the oversight of the launch and reentry operations, spaceports, and the thankfully continued good safety record that we've seen relative to those activities. And we heard from AST on the need for more staffing, that they're currently at a staffing level of 135, looking at growing to 155 soon, and that a significant aspect of that is their ability to manage the throughput and demand for licensing, launch, and reentry operations, as well as the spaceports piece. And so, one of the things I'll highlight in regard to this question is that there's certainly, we could have a conversation today that focuses solely on human spaceflight, right? And this question of the learning period and informed consent and Part 460, which is the section of the regulations that speak to human spaceflight specifically. I would say that we would be mistaken to have that conversation in a vacuum of only talking about human spaceflight. It certainly is important to put any conversation about a regulator in context with their other obligations and regulations. And I'll note that to date, they certainly are consumed with the activities. We've had, only 4 operators move to Part 450 successfully, and only 4 launches that have occurred under the launch and reentry licenses. And it is taking longer. We've had multiple notices to Congress about the ability to undertake and complete that licensing, even using the tolling tool in the 180-day time period that is statutorily required. So I think this is important context for the agency's ability and the challenges that the agency will face in moving forward with any regulations and enacting and bringing in the expertise that would be necessary for those. So I think we should certainly not ignore that challenge as we talk about whether they should or should not have that authority, because should they receive that authority, it is a significant challenge ahead. And I think that, as we probably will talk to today, their ability to regulate if there is an incident that calls into question safety exists. And, the idea that a bad day could give rise to that is certainly one that could happen today, much less if there is, if the learning period is not extended. And of course, speaking of context, we should be cognizant of the context of Congress. We have a divided Congress. And so, the ability to move an extension through may be a bit challenging this year. So I think that, if the learning period is not extended, I guess my guess about that is less that it is an active decision one way or another, but it could be the result of the congressional split right now and a lack of ability to agree within and across chambers on what would take a proactive congressional passage of law, statutory change. So I think that's an important piece. So the context of congressional, the context of the agencies, authorities now and their resource constraints now and need for more of those and capabilities within the organization. And then, of course, there's a larger conversation about where things like mission authorization live and what, some of the activities that are being discussed in that context do involve human spaceflight activities, which currently are not within the authority of the AST by virtue of the on-orbit question, much less
good point.
Learning period. So I think there's quite a bit to unpack here. I think we have more than enough discussion for the day.
I think so. That was great. So you've now heard from those who believe that for many of the reasons that Jim and of course Karen just brought up, where extending this moratorium would serve the public interest. Let's move to George, your perspective, and then to Bruce. So George, you're on.
Thanks, Courtney, and thanks to the Beyond Earth Institute for organizing this discussion today. Commercial human spaceflight safety is a really important topic. But as I listen to folks talk about it, I will frequently hear two very different perspectives on where we are and how we need to proceed going forward. One perspective is that while it's true that we have been sending people into space for more than 60 years, U.S. industry has only done it a couple of dozen times. As a result, we don't have enough data and experience yet to know how to write any safety rules and regulations. And we can't trust the government not to develop potentially burdensome regulations that might end up stifling the industry before it even gets going. So the government needs to give industry free rein to decide how to keep the crew and spaceflight participants safe on their missions while the companies are figuring out how to do it. Now, at some point, after a few hundred or a few thousand missions, and potentially including a few fatal accidents along the way, we will know enough to be able to write regulations that can prevent those accidents in the future. But for now, we're just fine the way they are. The second perspective is that the US human spaceflight companies and their billionaire owners and investors are just doing this for the money. Now, they are certainly not trying to be unsafe, but we can't trust them to maintain a healthy safety culture or not to cut corners on safety issues if it is going to affect the financial bottom line. Therefore, as soon as possible, the government needs to publish a whole bunch of very prescriptive regulations to tell industry exactly what they need to do to keep their crew and customers safe. Personally, I don't agree with either of those perspectives. The question that I think we need to be focusing on is this: is it possible for us to have a commercial human spaceflight regulatory framework that takes advantage of what we've learned over the last 62 years of human spaceflight and then encourages the continuous improvement of human spaceflight safety while still allowing advanced technologies, innovation, and new ways of doing business? I think the answer to that is yes. Now, we can talk in more detail during the Q&A about what that could look like, but I believe that if we can all come together, roll up our sleeves, and talk this through, we ought to be able to put together a regulatory framework that both industry and government can support. And that would go a long way towards not only improving safety, but also towards the overall health and success of the commercial human spaceflight industry.
That was great, George. Thank you so much. And now, Bruce, Washington, D.C., people love to form opinions, not necessarily based on going back to the primary, the document. And so as one of the authors of the report, and I'm sure many who have not had a chance to read it, like to get your overall perspective, both on what you've heard and why you believe that that the moratorium should be allowed to lapse, and we should begin to engage some of the issues George talked about.
Yeah, thanks very much for hosting this very, very important discussion and moderating it. And thanks also to the other panelists for their perspectives and really helping build a good foundation for this discussion. The exciting thing about being part of RAND is that we've got more than 75 years of space-related research. You just heard George say we've only been doing activities in space for 62 years. So how's that possible? Well, RAND actually wrote a report that outlined all the potential uses of space that we take for granted now, 10 years before the launch of Sputnik. It's available on our website if you want to check it out. It's really an amazing historical document that's both a combination of engineering and policy implications. And we've written over 1,200 reports in the time since then, strictly on the topic of human space activities. A wide range of them. And so we were excited when the FAA came to RAND to fulfill their congressional obligation in the 2015 U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act to have an outside entity do an independent assessment of 3 specific areas that are covered in detail in the report. That's what RAND thrives on, is the ability to do this independent, objective assessment of topics. We don't have a stake in any of the different communities in terms of what their specific commercial or governmental interests are. We have an interest in investigating the information and the details that are available and coming up with the best possible solution, insights, and recommendations moving forward. And I'll mention now, because I'm going to be very brief so we can get into Q&A, this material, this report, which is about 125 pages, including some appendices, is already available on the RAND website. I encourage people to go look at it. It's being briefed to ComStack. As Karen mentioned, there was a meeting. It was within the last 10 days on the 15th, I believe. There's a link to the YouTube video where one of the lead authors, Ben Miller, gives an excellent presentation with slides that we're going to make available here that talks about the findings of the report, and then goes into a very robust Q&A about it. So I encourage people to go back and dig into those details. To focus us on the discussion here, really the key takeaway that I wanted to highlight in these opening remarks is that RAND, based on the information that was made available to us from both industry, government, and our own historical analysis, recommended that the moratorium on spaceflight participant safety regulations be allowed to lapse on October 1st, as per the current law. I want to be very clear, and we've stated this in many venues, that the recommendation to allow the moratorium to lapse is different than regulation itself. All we're saying is that the FAA should be given the authority to regulate, but that doesn't mean that we are recommending a large stockpile of regulations immediately. In fact, it's just the opposite. We would just broadly call this expanding the learning period to include more tools and resources. The second point I'd like to make, and then I'll wrap for now, I just want to reinforce something that Karen brought up, and it was our second recommendation in the report, and that was the need to properly resource the FAA to take on this specific aspect of human commercial spaceflight regulation, but also all the other aspects of oversight and support to industry and society that are growing very, very rapidly and are outpacing the resources of the FAA at this time. So those two recommendations were intended to go hand in hand. You have to resource the organization that will eventually be responsible for the regulation that we are not recommending right now, but you also need to give them the flexibility to open up some new tools to include informal rulemaking activities that are part of the collaborative discussion with industry as we move forward. So let me stop there, and I look forward to the further discussion on the subject.
Bruce, that was excellent. And I want to thank Cody for putting the link to the Comstack discussion into the chat. And I believe, Bruce, Cody will also have a link to some of the slides that you very kindly provided us, right, Bruce? So at some point, just to make the audience aware, we'll provide those links. Well, a lot of content here, so let's see if we can begin to get into it. I guess the first thing, George, let me go back to you. If you've heard what Bruce just had to say, do you want to add anything to what Bruce's perspective? After all, you ran the office, you managed the rulemaking process. Anything you want to add before I go on and get Karen and Jim's perspective?
I think he did a good job of setting the context here.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to recognize that the FAA has stated that they do not have regulations ready to go. What they're asking for at this point is the ability to start engaging with industry and other stakeholders on what that regulatory framework should look like. And even after they get to a point, if they do, that says, we think this regulation needs to be in place, following the Administrative Procedures Act policies that the federal government has to comply with, it will typically take 5 years or longer to get to a final rule. And during that period, industry and other members of the public are encouraged to ask questions and raise objections and express their concerns, if any, about the proposed rulemaking. So I think those are all important things to keep in mind.
So Karen, let me go to you. I'm thinking of the blue collar neighborhood I grew up in, the outside the bubble taxpayer who may be listening to this and thinking, gee, control explosives, putting people up in space, based on what they just heard from Bruce and George, it seems awfully benign and commonsensical. Let this moratorium lapse and begin to engage with what George has acknowledged is a protracted process. What are we missing? Why not proceed along the lines that you've just heard from Bruce and George?
So I think that this is where, I guess, experience causes some skepticism, right? And so, one of the things that I love to explore in my class at Georgetown is, the difference between what it says in the books and what that means in practice, right? And so, the experience that we had, for example, in industry with the Part 450 reform isn't exactly one that garnered a lot of faith and expectation.
Just very quickly for the uninformed, could you spend just a second?
Yes, right. The streamlining of the launch and the reentry regulations, right? So the streamlining of the regulations that govern the activities that are the bread and the butter of AST, right? So the traditional both suborbital and orbital launch and reentry licensing activities. So covering things like the activities. So if these regulations govern the activities that have been ongoing for decades now, and of course have increased in cadence significantly recently, though I will note that, as I noted before, only 4 launches have occurred under the new regulations now, over the starting last year and into this year. All of the activities that are occurring, the many Falcon 9 launches, for example, that we see happening, I think 24 now plus, those are occurring under the old regulations. And, I'll admit, I've said this to many people, there were many a time when I felt like the dog that caught the car and then got dragged along behind it, because I partnered with colleagues at other companies who were, part of the launch and reentry industry to advocate for regulatory reform for many years, waged a whole campaign around it. And, we got that. And the regulations that we got, the process was not as collaborative as we would have liked. We did things like sit in rooms for days and provide red lines to the regulations as recommendations, given our experience in the industry. And, the Administrative Procedure Act does have the opportunity for comment, right? It does not, though, depending on the agency's interpretation of the requirements of the agency, the legal requirements, it is not definitively a collaborative process. So I think that there's a bit of trauma around that experience that carries forward, because some of the same entities that would be involved, of course, and are involved in human spaceflight are the very entities that sat in that room with me, putting a Herculean effort into suggesting regulatory changes and engaged meaningfully and, collaboratively across competitors in our industry to try and garner an outcome that, of course, focused on safety. Absolutely zero change to the safe levels of safety, levels of risk were being advocated for, solely approaches to process that allowed for, the innovation that we're doing in the industry. So it's a lot of words to say we have a bit of a breakdown in trust there.
Yes.
I'll also note that there's not a significant amount of activity to Dr. Neal's point, between the last license or the last learning period extension and today. And there certainly have not been activities that have called into question our ability to operate in a safe manner. That I think, the existing system has not been stressed in a manner that demands action. So what I think the result of that is that there's a lack of expectation that we will have that collaborative approach. I'll also note that it is my interpretation of the law today that the engagement that we've discussed, the idea that the FAA would get together with industry and talk about what regulations could look like or what a process would look like or understand what the important elements would be. I do not interpret the law today as forbidding that conversation, right? And so I think that's an important point that goes back to, do they have the resources to engage in that meaningfully? Yeah. And, is there enough of a need? Because we do need to have operational launch and reentry licenses. We do need a process that can govern that, because nobody is going to space, humans or otherwise, if we can't get licenses. And we do have, what we have had is launch vehicles sitting on a launch pad ready to go without a license.
Yeah.
So I think that, we have to keep these things in context. Nothing has significantly changed. Nothing has stopped them from having that conversation in the past. And if we can't even get off the ground, then there's no risk to people going to space.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you. And I do want to say, with respect to some of the FAA friends, and I consider them that on the call, that by no means does anybody take away from the amount of hard work that office put into review. But I also know that Karen and others literally put in 24/7, and there was a huge amount of investment by industry with both engineering and legal and so forth. And I've heard across the board.
I think it's a really important point that there's no, I think, thought in industry, and I hope there's not a thought currently in the regulatory agencies that there is any ill will or any the situation is one that is born of a lot of factors. It's not one that is born of I think any kind of oppositional situation between the entities.
No.
There are a variety of pressures that came to bear on that situation, and one of them, I think an important one, as we talked about in ComStack and has been raised, is the offices, the resourcing of the offices, its ability to do what it's thankfully doing now, which is invest in processes streamlining, process management capabilities, and also to attract and retain the talent of people so that they have, they can more than series consider license applications. Yeah. They can do multiple in parallel.
All right. With that, we've been hearing everything you're saying. Occasionally you stop for a second, freeze. So I don't know whether that's a bandwidth issue, but you're coming across fine, but just an FYI on that. So with that, Jim, I know you have a few opinions. You've sat in many of these rooms, particularly in the Part 450, and I know that there's some issues of, I hate to use the word credibility, but it's really what the follow-up might well look like. So on the government side, but with that, your response. Well, and again, just a few minutes.
If you look at my head here, there used to be hair here.
Yeah, I
There
used
was
to have hair too.
more hair there before in 2017. Karen and Audrey and Christopher and a number of other really brilliant attorneys and engineers in the launch industry said, we need to go get these rules streamlined because the number of flights is going to go up and FAA will be trapped. And so as a human battering ram, I threw myself at the FAA and Congress and OMB and the Space Council staff and others, and sort of it's my way of diplomacy. We got them to start a rulemaking effort because basically we got the Space Council to tell them to start a rulemaking effort. Of course, as Karen says, sometimes when you catch the car and you're dragged along by your teeth, you forget that you were trying to get to the car. Yeah. I guess the problem to me is I hear you, Bruce, say that you don't want to actually for anyone to start regulating now. Well, they can do anything short of regulating now. They can publish advisory circulars now on occupant safety. They can discuss regulatory frameworks with us now. They could hold meetings with us now. In fact, they already set up an aerospace rulemaking committee that will be free of FACA rules. In other words, you can have private discussions within there between industry as a whole and the government as a whole, and have that sort of engagement and interactivity and collegiality that Karen was speaking about on this very issue, on how should human spaceflight safety be encouraged and facilitated by the government. No one has said that the FAA shouldn't actively take steps to encourage occupant safety. The only thing they can't do is actually publish a draft rule. Now, if somebody thinks that they need to be able to publish a draft rule just to get industry to talk to the government, I would say that Part 450 is a great example of how industry stepped up with huge resources and efforts to talk about an area of unquestioned authority for the FAA to do a better job of regulating for public safety. Right. I don't understand why FAA needs to be able to actually start writing rules when they don't know how they want to write the rules. There's been no accidents which actually would let them write a rule now. Yeah. Remember, they can write a rule now if there's a reason to write a rule. Jim,
at that point, I think you framed the proposition well. So let me move you to Bruce, since your name has been brought up, the RAND. Why now? Why given what Karen and Jim has said about the existing abilities of the FAA to move forward with advisories and begin to lay their groundwork for rules and so forth over time. Why do we have to take something as precipitous as allowing the moratorium to lapse? So turn it over to you, Bruce.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate this. An excellent conversation, and it shows really the complexity of the issues, right? So it's important that people don't come away from this kind of a conversation with a very black and white,
binary,
a binary kind of approach to things. And we talk about that in our analysis too, and George mentioned it as well. So I appreciate that. A couple of things that I'll point to that's really the evidence-based analysis that we did and first of all, I think we should avoid. I'm going to propose that we refer to it as a moratorium on regulation. Because if we refer to it as a learning period, what I would tell you is the evidence that that was made available to RAND indicated a low level of learning and sharing of information between industry and government. And so this is one of the reasons that I would respond, why now? Yes, there are some examples. Part 450 was just mentioned, but at the point of kind of most critical analysis, when Rand was out seeking information on what has the industry learned over the past few periods of this moratorium that you can point to that has indicated that this moratorium approach is the way to go, or whether or not should be continued. And there was, frankly, very little information that was made available, right? There are standards development organizations that are doing things. They've developed some standards, but that process, by all accounts, is slow. And there was no way for us to independently verify that industry is adopting those standards. There are safety practices that exist, we're told, but in all cases, they were considered proprietary. And the metrics that we were also asked to evaluate, there was no way for us to evaluate them effectively because of the lack of information shared with either the FAA or with us as an independent assessor of the status of how effective the moratorium has been in to give people this kind of growth and quote unquote learning period. So that why now? I would say the evidence pointed to the fact that the moratorium didn't necessarily help with the creation of consensus standards and voluntary rules. So why continue it would be the counter question. And again, this doesn't mean an immediate imposition of any number of regulations. You have to balance this with what Rand also recommends, which is appropriately resourcing the FAA, which, by the way, was universally recommended by all the stakeholders that we talked to. It wasn't just something the FAA asked for. 100% of the industry representatives that we talked to said the FAA is under-resourced for the mission that they've been given to do across all fronts. And as Karen mentioned, that's not just human commercial spaceflight regulation. That's all aspects of the industry. And the numbers have been put around. AST has only been provided 10 additional personnel in the most recent rounds of funding. It was beyond the scope of our research to come up with some kind of a number. We did have people suggest the appropriate levels of staffing for the FAA, but that frankly would be another important analytical effort to go back and say, well, how many people does the FAA actually need to perform its mission before some number is just thrown out as part of this process. So yeah, that's a long answer, but I would say the moratorium, first of all, there's no other place that we're aware of where a moratorium of this type was imposed. And based on the evidence that was made available to us, there's no indication that the moratorium actually fostered the kind of learning that was intended for this kind of moratorium. So allowing the moratorium to lapse doesn't impose immediate regulations, but it actually catalyzes more learning. And I would say it actually expands the learning process.
Bruce, if your fellow panelists will allow me just to pull on the thread a little bit, what's your sense of why the stakeholders were not forthcoming with such information? What could be the motivation?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be fair to them, it's really their place, the stakeholders being the commercial providers, the human commercial space launch providers. It's a question better for them to answer. I actually went back and checked, and so towards the end of our report, there's a footnote, and I think there were 3 different categories where we were told that we couldn't be provided information, even though Rand, as an independent objective assessor that was doing this on behalf of the government for Congress, we sign non-disclosure agreements all the time, right? So this didn't have anything to do with us like somehow not being willing to protect proprietary information. But in many cases, the first thing that we were typically told was, this is proprietary information and we cannot share it with you. Gotcha. Then there were sometimes legal rationales brought up for the reasons that they couldn't share information. And again, it's not my place or Rand's place to question industry and their motivations, but those were the reasons that were stated. But it kind of goes back to reinforce this point. If there was an unwillingness on the part of industry to share something as simple, in my opinion at least, as an informed consent document that every human commercial spaceflight participant is already regulated to have to sign to be provided and signed. So George, you had to sign something like this. We asked for those to say, well, let's compare across the different industry providers. How are they portraying risk to their participants? 100% of the cases, we were unable to get even that simple, non-technical informed consent document for the reasons that I stated.
Well, thank you for that. And I've got to move to Professor Karen, and we're in your hat, and you probably were party to some of those with your previous companies. What is your insight as to both Bruce's points about the fact that the so-called learning period has not borne a lot of fruit in terms of informing the rulemaking efforts, and why, if I may ask, Karen, your sense of why companies would be so reluctant, and should we be concerned about that? So, Karen, your perspective.
So I'll start with, I'm not concerned by that. I'm not surprised by it. We have a very small number of companies, right? So there are currently 3 operators of human spaceflight, commercial human spaceflight activities. I believe I'm right about that, right? So Blue, Virgin, SpaceX. You have Boeing that is developing a capability for NASA orbital ISS capabilities, and Sierra Space, I believe I'll add in as looking to do human spaceflight activities as well. And yeah, so 3 operational, 2 suborbital, 1 orbital, and under contract with NASA, which
and
means
then others in prospect, like VAST,
another in prospect, right?
Revetics, yeah.
So pretty limited and a highly competitive situation. And of course, there are companies like Axiom, for example, that are doing business, VAST, doing business with a provider of human spaceflight capabilities that then have responsibilities themselves for engaging with their customers. And, you know, your ability to engage with very sophisticated, high value clients, customers, spaceflight participants, or your ability to undertake this activity, and your ability potentially to undertake this activity in a way that provides, of course, the information that you're required, provides the information that you and your legal team and your risk management team believes that you should provide, and does such in a manner that is appropriate to your client, right? So Dr. Neal could certainly probably not speak to exactly what he did or did not experience, but the way that a Blue Origin or a Virgin or a SpaceX or an Axiom or in the future a Sierra or a Boeing, the way that they're going to approach, there's a very kind of, I'd say, bespoke aspect to this clientele. These are very sophisticated people. It is not, it's not something that you can find a $20 bill in your pocket and then decide to go out and do. I don't know how many people who've listened to this have jumped out of airplanes or done other hazardous activities, but there's an aspect to that is probably the same across various places as a result of the quantity of activities, right? So there's become a practice around it. Probably there, in certain hazardous activities that are also high quantities, an insurer can advise that, its client on how to structure, and there's case law on, good case law and studies, and perhaps even state law that governs what you sign and do not sign. And that's true in spaceflight, for example, right? Various states have informed consent on top of the federal. So, but how you manage that process and how you cater to your client there in this very high value, right? Specialty clientele. This is, talk about a luxury experience. This is a luxury experience, right? This is the shutting of the store, and it's not me walking into, name your retailer on my corner. It's a bespoke experience. So I think there's something to that, and the competition there. I also think that this is a place where, we see guidance from the FAA, for example, on human spaceflight and what you need to accomplish with your crew or with your spaceflight participant in terms of informed. That guidance is out of date. It's on the list of things that the FAA could update and could put out as here are ways that we think would fulfill the existing requirements, like informed consent, and that would. That could be helpful to the point, for part of what the RAND study highlighted. I also think that, every company, for example, there are regulations on how companies deliver flight safety analysis and trajectory data. And there are some, there's some of that is prescriptive, right? You have to do it a certain way, but there's a lot of that is based on the company's ability to develop it, and that is regulated. And what you won't find if you tried to go to companies is they would be probably very highly unlikely to provide their flight safety analysis methodology in a public way, and your ability to compare those across, again, a small number of entities, but that are doing something that is regulated. So I think that just because something is regulated doesn't mean there's going to be a consistent and or a consistent practice around it, or a willingness to share it in such a very tight, competitive environment that we have in space. It's a very small number of participants. So I think that's a really important piece about this. And I think that there definitively is learning happening, right? These companies are figuring out how to operate in a safe manner in order to fulfill their obligations to, themselves, and also to fulfill the high amount of regulation that does exist with regard to their activities, right? So we do care very much about protecting the public, and the regulations and the regulatory effort is such that I'll note under Part 450 in particular is not possible to be navigated in under 180 days currently, right? And these are by sophisticated people who have navigated through the licensing for other activities. So it's not as if it is, the Wild West of activity that is occurring out there. There is significant regulation, and there's significant capabilities. I'm always hesitant to raise the point that the orbital activities that are occurring are currently occurring in partnership with NASA. And I raise that to say that they couldn't visit the ISS, and they can't do some of the activities that they're doing, but for their ability to meet NASA's requirements. That's always
the very voluminous 508.
Right, exactly. Now, that's always something you want to be hesitant about, because the last thing I think industry wants, and that even NASA thinks would be appropriate, is to take the NASA requirements and plug those into the regulations. Yeah. That said, if some of these questions are the result of some stress or anxiety around the idea that industry is off to the races without, oversight, there are a lot of things to point to say that their oversight is occurring and safety is paramount, and safety is not being done, solely behind closed doors with nobody involved. I will also lastly note that, part of the informed consent regime, which, I agree with Bruce, words matter here, right? The informed consent regime requires that before somebody pays funds, so you can do reimbursable deposits, but before they truly sign up, they have to be briefed on the safety record, and they have the right to bring in experts with them. So before you sign up to pay millions of dollars to go to space, if you have the millions of dollars to go to space, I can imagine that you have the ability, if you would like, it is your choice, to bring in aerospace experts, human spaceflight experts, and have them advise you and help you assess the risk in collaboration with the company that you are flying on. And that is part of the existing regulation today.
All right, Karen, thank. That's a lot there. George, I'm going to turn to you. You're the one person amongst us who has strapped in, signed your waivers, and had that glorious suborbital experience. Based on what you've heard now from Bruce and just from Karen, your reaction in terms of learning period and why we need, in your judgment, again, to proceed down the proactive approach that you laid out earlier.
So some excellent comments by everyone, and it reinforces that this is not a simple issue, but we need to figure out how to work together to get through it. Just a couple of points based on both comments that have been made and questions in the chat box. First, a couple of people have said, well, we have had no accidents, so everything's fine. And FAA, you can issue a regulation after somebody dies. That to me is not very satisfying. I think the FAA has long been criticized by some in Congress on the aviation side for having a, quote, tombstone mentality, that you don't do anything until something bad happens and then you do something. I think the space community is more sophisticated than that, and we're trying to anticipate any issues, and that's the right frame of mind to keep in mind, I think. So the companies that are offering these capabilities right now, outstanding companies, good technical, excellent safety culture, great experience, they're doing a great job. There is nothing that guarantees that Joe's Rockets is going to come along and have the same experience, expertise, and safety culture next week. And they don't have to have that same mindset and those same capabilities as the companies that do today. So just as Jim Muncie was pointing out before, there can be either bad actors or people who just aren't up to the challenge of doing this and doing this safely that we need to be aware of, because again, once that happens, it's bad for the whole industry, not just that one company. A couple other points. I think it's important to recognize that, yes, space transportation is inherently risky, as Congress pointed out in the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004. And if the moratorium does expire, the informed consent regime will remain. And so customers will have to be briefed on the risks, on the safety record, and then sign the waiver if they're willing to accept that risk and take that. So that much is in place, and I think that's appropriate for this point in the industry. And then finally, some have asked, well, if you're saying regulations are bad, what can we do now? I think a perfect thing to start on and to focus on and prioritize is voluntary industry consensus standards. And yes, there are mechanisms to do that today. There are people who have said they want to do it, but the progress has been very slow. Why is that? RAND talked a little bit about that in their report. I think, frankly, because there's no incentive for companies to have their best engineers spending time and effort on development of standards while they are trying to design and build and operate rockets right now. So yes, it's for the greater good, but it's not something that they would get an immediate payback on. And so if there's a way to break down that concern or the reticence to actually getting this done, and if they need help from an FFRDC, whether that's RAND or Aerospace or MITRE or somebody else or the FAA, great. But I think it would be awesome if industry could say, here's some standards that we can live with. FAA, what do you think? And then there wouldn't be the need for oppressive regulations if it's clear how industry is doing their best to keep these operations safe. So that may be a bit naive, but I think that would be a great
George,
goal to achieve if we can do it.
Play a little bit of devil's advocate, and then Jim, I want to get your comments on this. You talk about proverbially Joe's space venture, whatever, that doesn't have necessarily the expertise of one of the existing marquee companies. But isn't it true that for a company that would be proposing a new structure in space, crewed, pressurized, they have to first and foremost find their launch vehicle, which of course is subject to your former office's process. And and what we've been hearing in this discussion is that today there are authorities that allow your former office to do the advisories and certainly begin to, with the emergence of this Space Advisory Committee, the SPARC, to begin to engage industry. Is it, I mean, it's not as if there isn't already procedures in place, right? Again, just playing devil's advocate with you.
So maybe a little bit of semantics, but I think the ideal scenario is for industry to say, here's some standards that we can all live with. What do you think about that, government? As opposed to the government saying, well, here's some standards, they're voluntary, you don't have to do them, but this is what we think.
Jim Muncie, reaction?
I don't know how the authority to regulate is necessarily going to speed up the standards process. George said the companies are busy developing their vehicles. That's true. But at the same time, they are putting resources into developing standards. We have worked very hard. The members of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation that have led the effort within ASTM, Mike Lopez Alegria from Axiom and can't remember his name right now, but Andrew Nelson from now working from one of the spaceport design firms. They worked very hard. A lot of other company people have worked very hard and have started getting standards. We can't get prioritization of standards out of FAA because they don't want to just pick, like 3 areas that they think are the most important to write standards on. So no one has offered industry resources to help pay for the technical expertise involved in producing standards. That they're taking away from everything else. So, it doesn't seem to me how that's going to be solved by the authority to regulate. And what FAA AST people tell me is that the only way they could regulate now would be to actually require the adoption of regular standard of certain appropriate standards. In other words, if there's some set of 10 standards out of, for example, the American Standard Testing Method, whatever ASTM stands for, and if 9 of those actually apply to your vehicle or are relevant to your vehicle, then you have to meet all 9 of them, or 8 of the 9, something like that. That's I don't understand what. It's almost as if people are saying we want the threat of unrestricted regulatory power to force you to do the right thing as industry. Industry's already doing the right thing. There was an accident in 2014, unfortunately, in a test flight by Scale Composites. And in that situation, as George has pointed out, there was authority to regulate, but they didn't regulate. And the reason they didn't regulate is because Virgin Galactic took over the testing program itself, made every possible change they could make to the vehicle design. They took all of the recommendations that they got from the National Transportation Safety Board investigation. They did other investigation and redesign issues of themselves. They did all of that without a regulation.
Gotcha.
If that's how industry is behaving, why do we need to regulate?
It's a good point. To stop just for a moment, I want to thank the audience members who have contributed some great observations and questions, and I want to thank a couple of our panelists who've been responding on the chat. Unless any of the panelists have any burning comments to make, I wonder if I could, at this juncture, open it up to the audience. And I want to see here, is that okay with all of you? Would anybody have a burning response? And if you've heard anything that's Jim or others have said, perhaps in the following comments, you can respond. Rand Semberg, you're on, right? Do you want to come on camera for a moment?
Sure.
And Rand, just to tell people, Rand is engineer and has been an analyst in this area for years, wrote Safety is Not an Option book years ago, really as a Pathfinder book on the whole issue of safety and the very topic we're talking about. So Rand, thank you for taking a moment. I know you had a question in the chat, but if you want to make an observation, pose a question, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I think a lot of my answers, the questions in chat have been answered in the content, course of the conversation. I take a kind of a higher level view or question, and that what is our goal? Because the title of the book is "Safe is Not an Option." There's nothing we do in life that's guaranteed to be safe. We talked at the beginning about, airline type reliability. We're a long way from that. It took decades to get there with the airlines. It's going to take probably maybe not as long with space because technology is accelerating. But my concern is that we have sort of a one size fits all mentality. And, for instance, NASA came up with, don't forget what the number is, 1 in 270 for loss of crew, for commercial crew. A number that if you got Phil McAllister, with a beer, he'd tell you that number is both arbitrary and unverifiable, right? And it's a one size fits all. So it doesn't matter what the mission is. That's what it has to be. We can't risk an astronaut's life, even if it was something that was really, really important. And for commercial, people have different risk tolerances. In fact, some people are adrenaline junkies and they kind of get off on the fact that it's dangerous. And so I say in the book, the least safe way to get to 29,000 feet is to walk there. But we don't regulate that. Nobody regulates trips, people want to climb Everest. So the question is, what is the purpose of the regulation? What are we trying to accomplish?
Thank you, Rand. And I just put a link to Rand's book in the chat. And I want to thank Bruce also, who kindly sort of summarized sort of the key points in the Rand report in the chat. For those in the audience who want to take a look at those key points. George, anybody want to react to what you just heard from Rand?
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Okay.
Sorry, George, if you had something first, you were called out and I'll follow with.
Great comments. So I would just flip the question around just a little bit and ask, is there anything that the community can do, government, industry, associations, academia, that could improve human spaceflight safety over time? And if there is, I think we ought to at least talk about it. And it may not be regulations, whether it's a moratorium or not, whatever. I think transparency is good. Collaboration is good. Flexibility is good. Having options in the regulations. It's not just you have to follow the NASA crew standards. If you can meet the industry consensus standards, that ought to check the block. If you can respond to the FAA's recommended practices and say, yeah, we agree with those subjects. Here's how we internally have tried to meet those. You could have some kind of safety management system or independent approach that would say, our company has got a lot of better ideas. We don't believe in what the other guys are doing. Let's talk about having a safety case methodology, such as is in use by the UK Ministry of Defense or the nuclear industry or the offshore oil and gas industry, that basically says, okay, we have good safety practices. You can have an audit of that. And then the company makes their case to some independent, knowledgeable expert or entity and says, here's what we're doing internally to make these operations as safe as we can, recognizing that there will still be risk.
Okay. All right.
That ought to be a way to check the block. So there should be lots of choices, and let's all have the goal of, over time, continually improving human spaceflight safety. And if that doesn't need regulations, I'm good with that.
All right. Thank you, Bruce. You had comments, and I see my friend Michael Mealing as well has a comment. So let me go to you, Bruce, and then I'll call on you, Michael. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, I'll be very brief for time so others can comment. So one of the things I just want to reinforce is kind of two aspects of this is not a binary conversation point, right? So we chose our words very carefully when we titled the RAND report, and the subtitle is actually charting a trajectory from missionary to routine travel. So we by no means compare the current state of human commercial space flight to commercial aviation in present day. Absolutely not. We are barely in the barnstorming era of human commercial space flight, right? And there was a time when people climbed onto biplanes and strapped themselves literally to the wings of biplanes, and there was no regulation, and people died, and there were mishaps all over the country at a very much lower level in a different information age, and there was no regulation for it, right? Eventually, decades later, we got to the point where we are now, where the general public was traveling routinely, and there was a need for protection for their interests because they didn't have billions of dollars and a fleet of lawyers that could go and analyze the information available for their boutique curated space experience, right? We're in that interim period. And it's the same reason that Rand made the point, because our stakeholders indicated to us and the evidence indicated this is not a binary decision. You know, we could go anywhere from, like, one end of the spectrum is a complete extension of the moratorium or the status quo approach, right? Next along that kind of approach is an extension of the moratorium, but give the FAA more resources and authority. So modifying the moratorium, if you will, right? Rand actually recommended allowing the moratorium to end with the staffing for the FAA to allow them to do the learning and growth over the next several years, maybe even decade, so that we're ready and we don't have to jolt into a situation where there is a mishap and then Congress acts quickly in a less informed manner in response to a very highly visible loss of human life associated with human commercial spaceflight. So we're just trying to chart that trajectory and be somewhere on the trajectory that is prudent based on the evidence that we have. We do think there are ways to increase the information sharing. The Spark is one of the recommendations we made. So it's not a binary decision. Thanks.
Bruce, thank you so much for that. And Karen, if I may, given some of Bruce's comments, if you don't mind, respond. And then Michael, I promised I'll get to you in a moment, but I do want to hear Karen's immediate reaction.
Yeah, so I think that, in the scheme of ways to respond, a Spark, and I think it's important to, again, define what that is, right? So a Spark is a Space Advisory Rulemaking Committee. And, the way that a Spark can work is the FAA writes the charter for the Spark. We're doing one right now for the Part 440, which governs financial responsibility, and includes the waivers and insurance requirements, for example. So the Spark involves the FAA posing questions to members of industry, academia, et cetera, non-government participants. Government participants can be observers, but they cannot contribute, versus standard writing where government can be involved and can contribute. So in a Spark situation, you have a charter, you have a time period for a report from industry. Some Sparks, so some advisory rulemaking committees used in the FAA world, for example, for aviation, can take years and years and years to answer a small number of questions, a large number of questions, and to provide guidance to the agency. And then that can that supports the Administrative Procedure Act regulatory process to deliver an actual, a regulation at the end of the day. So I think that the idea of initiating a Spark should be no different than initiating an engagement with industry to talk about what they're doing and see if there are ways that we may be able to develop recommendations with regard to FAA engagement with industry. I will continue to emphasize the small number of people, and and the idea that, as I think, Courtney, you raised, the very high barrier of entry. There is a reason why the joke exists and continues to be repeated, as I will today, that what does it take to become a millionaire in space? It takes a billionaire, or at least a whole bunch of venture backers. It is not and we see a very small number of entities participating in human spaceflight. I would love to see a day where that is very common. I appreciate the subtitle of the, trajectory from revolutionary to routine. There is a long way to go between where we are today and that. And it's longer for us in space because it is technically so much more challenging than aviation spaceflight or aviation flight, right? Than regular aviation. So the ability to go from barnstorming to 747s commercially carrying people across the country, I don't think that you can take that and make that like a direct example to that same time scale will apply to space activity. I just don't think that that's in any way in the realm. And I think that actually is a very important point of why Jim Muncie lost so much hair and other, thought leaders did at the time on putting the moratorium in place. Was because they understood that the FAA's then the ASTs, the Space Transportation Office, was being embedded in an agency, the Transportation Department, which oversees other activities that where it's not just public safety, where it's the passengers, and these are activities like aviation that fly across the country every single day. I don't know if you could hear it, but some flying thing just went over my house, right? And it has to operate in a way that it's not going to come. We all believe it's not going to come crashing into my house right now as I sit here. So, and then trains go through areas, and that actually is also a sad point to make, which is we have highly regulated industries with a lot of standards. We don't tend to fly aircraft based solely on standards. So the idea that standards could be the thing that solve all the problems for us, not saying that anybody said that, but like standards are somewhat limited. And, the history of standards is a very interesting one about facilitating trade, right? And in high volume activities. But so even in areas in activities that are highly regulated, we still have accidents, and we have highly, tragic accidents that are high profile accidents. And it is not incorrect to say that those today, because of the availability of information and the speed of information, get a lot of attention and garner congressional action and result. I will say that in the cases that I can think of off the top of my head, those incidents happened because somebody was governed by a regulation, not because somebody was not governed by a regulation. So I think it is a mistaken idea to say that by virtue of imposing regulations on our industry, we will thereby have a different safety culture or a different safety outcome. Gotcha. I think we actually have an incredibly strong safety culture in our industry. I think that we all have a great deal of appreciation. And even as I can't even really speak comfortably about the idea of loss of life, because every one of us who's worked in this industry knows somebody who lost somebody, or knows, it feels very close. And that's just with a very small number of people. Gotcha. So I think that it's just, we're just in a different place. And to Bruce's point, drawing parallels or trying to say that because aviation is one way, we should be that way is very challenging. And the last thing I'll say is that I also am very sensitive to the idea that we smother our industry with love. So that in trying to be sure that we are, I think that we just have to be really thoughtful about the cost benefit analysis of our activities, right? So, a point that we've made in various parts of the conversation with regulations that exist today is, what is the cost benefit analysis? So yes, maybe I can provide you just that I can spend more and more hours. I can bring more and more of my experts in to talk to you. I can have to provide more and more paperwork to justify my approach. Does that improve the understanding of my safety by 1% or by 80%? If it's 80%, then maybe it's worth it. But if it gets to the point where we're not seeing some significant risk reduction, I'm not sure that we're at a point where we're going to see a big benefit of a huge oversight apparatus for our activities.
Got it. Karen, that is great. I must tell all of you, as a moderator, it is a joy, but also painful, because you all have so much to offer and they're so content rich that it's very painful to have to intervene and cut off. But those are extraordinarily very important points. Michael Mealing, you've been so patient. We're down to just a couple of minutes, and I've got to leave at least a minute for Steve Wolf. So, Michael, if you can come on, and
this shouldn't take long.
Great to see you, Michael.
Thanks, Courtney. Coming from outside the industry and as an investor in this sector, one of the other concerns that I don't think was quite voiced with regard to either standards and or regulation is there's a long history in technology fields with unfriendly competitors using both standards and regulations as a way to prevent new actors coming in the area, whether it's standards capture or regulatory capture. And so there is a fair amount of distrust of those two processes, unless they happen in particular ways. And I think that's one of the major issues, that there are two trust issues. There is a perception of a possibility that if indeed you increase the FAA's budget along these lines to be able to start doing some of this regulatory work, there's a fear that the people that end up being hired would come in with a common carrier mindset. And the mindset of the regulator drives what ends up coming out more than the black letter of the authorizations. That fear, I mean, for example, that's one of the reasons why general aviation in the US died in the 80s and 90s, is because the insurance industry was under the assumption that the government was saying this was 1000% safe, when indeed it wasn't and was never intended to be. And I think there's other nuances that come into this, and this is why one of the things about the informed consent regime that I particularly like, going all the way back to when I was at least tangentially aware of what was going on when Jim was writing this stuff. It's the escape hatch we need to be able to allow people to try things that the FAA and the regulators don't understand. And even if you get to the era of common carrier rocket flight, we still need the ability to strap yourself to a biplane equivalent.
And Michael, I apologize. We will have to end in a moment, but I think.
Yeah, thank you, Courtney.
That was wonderful comments. Thank you. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for, again, your comments and questions. We're going to now turn the microphone back to Steve, but in my introduction, I refer to the word fraught, and hopefully the audience walks away with a sense of the complexity of the issues and what the various perspectives are on this very important topic. So I cannot thank everyone today, Bruce and Karen and Jim and George, for your time and really framing the issues in an extraordinarily very compelling way. So thank you so much. And Steve, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. And thank you, Bruce, Karen, Jim, George, and of course, Cody. If I can offer a thought, what I'm getting from this conversation is that, that there's a lot of sincere effort going into trying to find the right answer. Even though there are varying viewpoints in this that came up, there was this sincerity of desire to find the right solution so that we can accelerate the potential for human space travel, right, over the coming decades, certainly years and decades, and I think as we develop the solutions, if you will, we certainly do not, especially in the early years, that the takeaway is that we do not want safety to be the logjam in this, because we do need to have that freedom and so forth. So with that, thank you all for joining us. Thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions and comments. It was an extraordinary discussion, one that will continue with Beyond Earth Institute, and we look forward to your participation next time. Bye now.
Beyond Earth is committed to the true purpose of why we go to space. Join us on this journey.